Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm Julie Moose, Executive Director of the National Press Club Journalism Institute. And on behalf of the Institute and our partner in this program, the News Leaders Association, we thank you all for making the time to be here today. And we thank you to our great panel. We're really looking forward to this important conversation that they're about to have. And we're very interested in your questions and your participation. So please queue up your questions in the Q&A anytime you have them, and we'll start with the panelists and then bring your questions in a little bit later in the program. So I'm very pleased to have the honor of introducing Michael Days, who is president of the News Leaders Association and vice president for diversity and inclusion for the Philadelphia Media Network, which includes the Philadelphia Inquirer, the Daily News, and Philly.com. Mike has been a reporter, city editor, managing editor, and has influenced just about every corner of the Inquirer, Daily News, and Philly.com newsroom, and has led them to Pulitzers. And he has long wrestled with the issues at the center of this conversation. And so it's my pleasure to turn the program over to him to get us started and to introduce our wonderful panelists. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you, Julie. And welcome to all of you. We wake up in the morning and go to sleep at night witnessing massive protests fueled by the murder in May of George Floyd. And for many, according to recent national polls, Black lives do matter. But despite the TV images that are real, the how we deal with this can vary based on race and party affiliation and age. Still a declining share of Americans give police positive ratings for using force, more than 50%, and that's a big drop from the Pew ratings from 2016. There seems to be more thought, more introspection among the American public about the conduct of police, and more thought about who goes to jail and how we as journalists best cover crime in our communities. There's talk on whether American citizens should have the right to sue police in their cities when bad behavior occurs, more thought about civilian oversight of police, how misconduct is traced, and what's the best way to handle nonviolent issues in our communities. I think it's a lot to take on, a lot to talk about, and a lot to cover, with distinction for those of us who work in all kinds of news operations around the country. That's why I'm thrilled to be in conversation with two of the best. Libor Jany is a Minneapolis crime reporter for the Star Tribune. He joined the newspaper in 2016 after stints in newsrooms in Connecticut, New Jersey, California, and Mississippi. He spent his first year working at the Star Tribune's Washington County Bureau, focusing on transportation and education issues before moving to the Dakota County team. Got his start in journalism in the sports department of his hometown paper, the St. Paul Pioneer Press. He attended Lewis and Clark College in Portland, Oregon, and Mississippi State University, majoring in communications with a minor in sociology. Our second panelist is Jamiles Lartey. He's a New Orleans-based staff writer for the Marshall Project. Previously, he worked as a reporter for The Guardian, covering issues of criminal justice, race, and policing. Jamiles was a member of the team behind the award-winning online database, The Counted, tracking police violence in 2015 and 2016. So why don't we get started? So, there's a lot going on. There's a lot to unpack. And I just wanted to start with, are we in sync with what's going on now in this minute or moment we're having? And do we need to change it all? How are we doing, gentlemen?
Who's we? The media?
The media.
In sync. That's a tough question. I would say, I always think it's important in conversations about media to kind of recognize that there have always been pockets, right? There have always been players in the scene who are watching these issues forever, right? Even before Mike Brown and before Ferguson, there were journalists who were reporting on police violence. There were journalists who were covering the militarization of police, or the ramifications of no-knock warrants, or stop and frisk. So I think the question really pertains less to are there folks in the industry who are attuned to these issues, and more to, has it proliferated newsrooms? Is it something that people in management positions and people who decide what's going on the cover, or what's leading the news hour, has it made it to those folks? And so to a large degree, right, we in this industry are kind of a dog chasing a car, right? Like things happen and we react, we go. So there's nationwide protests. Yeah, I think we're in sync for right now, or at least for the last 2 months, in the sense that the nation was broadly animated and interested in these questions, and we as an industry were talking about protests, talking about police reform. I think that sort of the better question to me is, will we remain engaged beyond that sort of flash of interest in the general public, and will we continue to highlight these stories when potentially folks' attention span has moved on?
Well, that is a better question. Thank you for that. So, what's the answer to that? What are you thinking in terms of can we stay engaged, and how do we stay engaged? I think it's a question, but I think we have to, don't you think, if we're going to do our jobs?
Absolutely. I mean, I certainly hope so. And I certainly hope, listen, I mean, I don't mean to be too, it's not hard to cover a protest. It's maybe slightly dangerous. Sometimes, there are unexpected things, people throw stuff, the police, especially in this latest round, have seemed to have less of an issue tear gassing or pepper spraying journalists than maybe historically they've had before. But from a reporting standpoint, you show up and it's right there in front of you, and you cover it. I think it's more difficult. It takes more stick-to-itiveness to cover your local police department, to cover police reforms, to cover kind of the less public and less performative, I guess is maybe the word, side of these questions. So can we? I think, yeah, it's certainly something that people in our industry, lots of people in our industry have the skill set to do, to file for public records requests, to analyze statutes that local city governments are writing in response to the public outcry, and say, hey, is this going to work, or what will be the side effects of passing a city ordinance or a federal law that will do this? Those are all skill sets that our industry has. I think the question is, do we have the interest and the mentality to stick with it? I hope so. I don't know if I can answer it in the affirmative, but I'm hopeful.
Well, you work obviously for the Minneapolis Tribune, and so that's sort of my skill set in terms of a daily paper, a Sunday paper, dealing with a whole lot of issues day in, day out, both print and online. Can we stick with it? Do we have to stick with it? Do we have to be really intentional about how we move forward?
We do. I would argue that, yeah, again, there have been reporters, and I suppose I can only speak for this newsroom, but there have been reporters in the room that have been attuned to these issues for years and have been writing these sort of stories. Institutionally, maybe the paper didn't come around until this most recent police killing. I get the sense just by, through talking with my colleagues, that the burden really falls on the reporters to lean on management, lean on the editors months down the road, as you said, after the world's gaze has sort of drifted to the next story. So I'm hopeful, but yeah, a lot of burden is going to fall on reporters to sort of push back and ensure that some of these changes do stick. So
Well, I have been an editor. I am an editor. How do we keep our editors in check? How do we communicate best to them that this will continue to be an important story?
Well, you gotta try to. The irony is that a lot of these critical questions come up on deadline, right? You've been out reporting the story the entire day, and then you race back and you're working on getting something online and then fleshing it out for the paper the next day. And these very critical, monumental decisions and questions arise in moments like this. And just the realities of working in the daily newspaper, you don't always have the luxury of time to tap your editor on the shoulder and have these sort of conversations. So you got to be very intentional about having them in quote unquote peacetime when you're not on deadline, and just to ensure that you're on the same page before you actually reach that point. So I have a pretty good rapport with my immediate editor, the public safety lead, where if I have any sort of concerns or if there's anything that I wanted to point out to her, I can take her aside and we can have that sort of conversation, so it doesn't become an issue later on. So.
Jamiles, you work for a publication that is really focused on criminal justice. Does that make it easier, or just makes you have to work harder to come up with different angles?
Yeah, I was going to say, how do you convince your editors that criminal justice matters, right? That's not a problem that I encounter in my work. I do think that, as a national outlet, we do have an obligation, right? I will take personal responsibility for the fact that I had a long background in police and law enforcement reporting. And in my first, several months with the Marshall Project, until this kind of George Floyd moment resurfaced, I was focused on a lot of other things. I was focused on the election and how criminal justice policy was going to shake out in the election, obviously coronavirus, more regional stories, looking at things down here in the South and in New Orleans. So, I guess I say that to say that even if you are kind of well apprised of this issue, even if you have a background in reporting it, it's still easy, right? It's still easy to just get caught up doing other things and to kind of accept that, okay, well, that conversation is over, right? We had that conversation around Ferguson. We had that conversation around Freddie Gray. We had that conversation around Philando Castile. And, people don't want to read that right now. So I should focus on, Trump or COVID, because that's what people care about. This has been a good kind of wake up call and reminder to me that, if something is important, it's important. And it doesn't necessarily, you can't rely on the vicissitudes of the news cycle to make it important.
I'm a good bit older than you, Jen, so I would like to think that this is not just a minute, but it could be a transformational moment. And I'm sure when you're with your colleagues and friends, there's debate. I know there is with mine, and I think among the older folks, we're like, well, we've been down this road before. This will pass. I would like to think that as journalists, we can be really very much involved, very intentional in making sure it doesn't just pass, because it's a big issue. Black and brown people deserve to be treated like human beings in their communities. It is interesting that a lot of middle class white people, upper middle class white people, seem to be very much taken with Black Lives Matter. If you witness Portland every day for God knows how long. So what say you? Is it a minute, or could it be a transformational period in how we deal with, how we police, how we criminalize folks, how we put people in prison, how we deal with the bail issues, all of that. I mean, can we ever change? Can there be change? And what's the role of the media? What's the role of journalists and all of that?
Bill, any of my friends will tell you, if you've ever spent much time around me, you'll probably get used to hearing the phrase, it's not either or, it's both and. And I think that applies to this, right? Is it a moment? Is it ephemeral in the sense that, will this level of attention and focus and emotional volatility persist forever, like indefinitely? No, of course not. I mean, that's just not the nature of public conversation. No issue, no matter how important or intractable it is, can just like survive at 100, forever. So yes, to a degree, it's a moment. It will pass, and people's attention will move on. Or a minute. But it's also a moment in the sense that, like in many ways, in politicians, in as you described, sort of the middle class, affluent white voters' mind, who for a long time was fairly agnostic on this question as a group, not as individuals. I think individuals made up their mind, but as a demographic group, didn't have strong pulls one way or the other on these questions of policing. I think there has been sort of I think there's a sea change. It's not total. It doesn't mean, that every single person in this demographic group or in others has changed their mind. But I think this moment has kind of flipped a switch in a way that was kind of in previous police violence moments, people were able to just sort of, a few bad apples, that kind of thing. I think that answer to the question, that answer to the, right, because, and you have to recognize that for a lot of folks, when they see these images on TV, but they deal with a suburban police department engaged in suburban style policing, there's a cognitive disconnect, right? They don't recognize this as policing. And so it's what the human mind does. If you've never seen police behave this way in your own personal experience, and you see a video of police behaving in a way, your first assumption will always be, that's just a few bad apples. Yeah. So I think this is a moment where, especially because the George Floyd video was so affecting and arresting, if I can use that term, and the kind of humanity of it. It didn't happen in a flash. It didn't happen in a moment. It wasn't a quick decision that you could sort of rationalize away. I think it did peel back a bit of the curtain and force people to consider some of their assumptions about policing. And I think that's durable. I think that's going to last beyond this. And I also think that we've already seen a number of laws passed. A piece I'm working on right now, I mean, I think in part makes the argument that in the case of Breonna Taylor in Louisville, the no-knock raid, the no-knock warrant may not be a policing principle that can survive this moment, just based on all of the legal questions that it raises. So, I mean, that's durable. The changes that have been made in Minneapolis, hopefully Libor can speak more to that. I mean, there's durability there.
Excellent. Libor, are you going to weigh in here?
I'd have to say I'm a bit more cynical or skeptical as it relates to this. And to your point, there's definitely been changes and things that have stuck, whether it's legislation that's been passed or just internally with the Minneapolis Police Department, certain reforms that went into effect shortly after George Floyd was killed. So there's definitely some progress that has been made, but maybe this is this sort of cynicism of a police reporter, or just somebody that's been reporting on this for some time. We've had other controversial episodes, not just in Minneapolis, but in the greater Twin Cities area. Jamar Clark, Justine Damon, Philando Castile in recent years. And it almost followed a very predictable and familiar pattern where there was that initial emotional outcry, and there were protests, and there were calls for greater police accountability and transparency. And, arguably, they didn't always lead to, substantive change. People's focus and attention invariably drifted onto, again, the next story. Some of these conversations kind of went on the back burner. So I think, again, that's where our role, and to echo a point that you made earlier, is our role as journalists is to kind of keep officials' feet to the fire, so to speak, and keep these issues in the sort of public consciousness, even when we haven't had an explosive moment like with George Floyd. So, the importance of writing these stories 6 months down the road, a year down the road, and continuing in that sort of coverage. But yeah, I'm skeptical.
I was doing a little reading the other night about changes in regulations made in Minneapolis several years ago. When you read those, and correct me if I'm wrong, it would have seemed, one would assume that George Floyd shouldn't have been possible. I think one of the rules I looked at, but if one cop sees another cop doing something that is not in regulation, they're supposed to speak up and stop it.
Yeah, and yeah, so that rule was. It's been around. The past chief, she was the one that sort of implemented that change. But if you talk to activists and they say that this is all like window dressing, some of these reforms or some of these proposed changes, that if you really want to change the system, you have to like uproot or disrupt this culture that exists within the police department that really just trumps any policies or reforms that you try to implement, where it's a paramilitary organization, and so there's a certain some tribalism or brotherhood that exists, where cops just kind of cover for one another and look out for one another. So until you actually get at sort of the root cause, you're gonna, that's at least the sense of some of these activists, that you're gonna continue to have incidents like this, episodes like this. Like, it doesn't matter what policies you have in place. It doesn't matter that you have a sanctity of life policy that says that everyone should come home at the end of a police encounter, not just the police officers, but civilians as well. It doesn't matter that you have a duty to intervene policy, because, clearly that didn't help in this situation. So.
Jamiles, I think I read a story the other day. I think you and Simone Weisselbaum wrote it about sort of the nature of police departments when they feel like they're on the scene. Police officers, when they're on the scene, they feel they've got to get control of the situation immediately, and that generally, they believe that generally requires force, significant force, aggressive force. I'm not going to say we should be writing more about it, because you guys wrote about it and it was a really, really good piece. But can that model be changed, you think, through journalism? I mean, I'm not a cop, not trying to be one, but you like to think that I know you guys are writing about de-escalation, that kind of stuff all the time. Should there be another way to handle the streets when there isn't significant danger to others? I guess I would ask.
Well, right. I mean, so I think your question is kind of in two parts, right? I think there's a question of, is there another approach that police departments administratively can take in how they deal with citizens? I think the answer is a resounding yes. There's other ways to deal with conflict. There's other ways to deal with the notion of controlling a situation. One of my favorite kind of policing concepts to think about and to talk about is this idea of officer created jeopardy, right? Like, when you show up in a situation and rush in as quickly as you can to an unstable situation, are you making it more unstable than it previously was? Could you have used, a police officer's best friend are time and distance, it's often said, right? Could you have used time and distance to allow the situation to resolve, to get a better tactical advantage, rather than sort of being Rambo and bursting in, as the alpha who's going to take control of the situation as rapidly as humanly possible, right? So I think administratively and as a matter of police science, if you want to call it that, there's a lot of research that's happening. There's a lot of trainings that are done. There's a lot of policies that are passed, as we've talked about. I think the second piece of the question is, do we, as the media, have a responsibility to shine a light on it or to talk about it? I mean, yeah, absolutely. I think most, and again, I don't mean to become like prescriptive to local reporters about what they need to cover, because, as a national reporter, I have a different set of expectations for my work, et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, I think just, right, in most American cities, you could do a story where you reached out to 10 people who had interactions with the police and asked them about what those interactions were like, right? Like, we hear so much, especially in local news reporting, that comes directly out of the mouth of a PIO, and it is a PIO's job to make the department look as good as possible. I'm not suggesting that PIOs are not to be trusted. I'm saying that that's their job, is to frame events in the most positive possible way that they can. And journalists, generally speaking, take a pretty skeptical view of what public relations people tell us. That's kind of part of the training and part of the ethos of journalism. And I think we could stand to sort of do more of that in policing, and simultaneously spend more time listening to folks absent the galvanizing violent moment that gets everybody talking. Just everyday policing. What are people's everyday experiences with the police? And maybe you interview 10 or 15 people and they all describe, courteous interactions where they're treated like human beings. I think that's a story too. And I do think that, as an industry, we need to be willing to tell stories that don't have a negative critical spin, because that's, makes for a more interesting headline. I think sometimes, especially when you're reporting on a neighborhood, when you're reporting on a place, sometimes, just check in. What's the status quo like? What is it? How does it feel? How does it taste? How does it smell to people who are living it?
Well, I just read a story the other day that sort of speaks to all what Jamiles was talking about. You wrote about one block. Is it North Minneapolis or South Minneapolis?
South Minneapolis.
Because it's been a long time since I lived in Minneapolis, where there was just one street that really would love some attention from the police. Talk about that a little bit and how you came to do that piece.
Well, so some of the residents reached out before George Floyd. They were just frustrated with the amount of drug activity on their block, and frustrated by what they saw as a lack of response on the part of the police, basically, that the police were ignoring the problem. They weren't responding until several hours later. Similar frustration with the local council member, that their emails and phone calls were sort of falling on deaf ears. And so, but then when I actually went out there and I started to talk to people and interview folks, everyone had sort of a different opinion on how the issues should be handled. And I would say, for the most part, they were sympathetic to the goals and ambitions of the defund movement, or even the abolish MPD movement. But what they were worried about is that they didn't think that those movements presented like an immediate solution to their own problems, right? So they're definitely opposed to police brutality, and not just these explosive acts of brutality, but just the daily harassment that sometimes occurs in some of these neighborhoods. But again, all they were looking for was an immediate relief from what was going on their blocks. And but you know, people, you definitely there was a wide variety of opinions again on a solution. Some people wanted stronger police enforcement. Some people were of the mind that, you know, a lot of these issues could be solved through more of a harm reduction model, and that, you know, even these, like a lot of these low level drug dealers are themselves dealing with addiction and mental health issues, and that, you know, maybe the police response that's not the best way to handle it. Maybe you bring out, again, employing the harm reduction model, you bring out people that distribute clean syringes and, you know, pick up the dirties and try to connect folks with all sorts of services and you know, get them stable housing and sort of solve the problem that way. But yeah, it was very, very eye-opening. And then I talked to an expert, a guy who was making the argument that, you know, there's all these conversations about over-policing in certain neighborhoods and overly aggressive police tactics, but that the issue is that some of these neighborhoods that have suffered from governmental neglect for decades have also been deprived of effective policing, and that even when they do call 911, for more serious crimes, for shootings and robberies, the cops don't respond in a timely manner. If they do, it's more of a roll by, and they don't really take their concerns seriously, and there's little follow through. So, yeah, that's.
You know, sometimes when you know, over many years, decades, when you look at stories that deal with crime, murder, issues in different communities, you know, often, I would argue that often the story is told from the narrative of the police department. Am I wrong on that? Or, I mean, if it's if you guys, if you had a magic wand, you had that magic wand for 10 minutes, what would you change? Are we elevating voices enough? Are there other things we need to be thinking about as journalists covering these stories in America?
Yeah, and it's try not to be too critical of some of my predecessors, because I think they were great journalists and they did a lot of fine work. But yeah, when I look through our archives, I do sense a certain deference to the police narrative and a lack of sort of scrutiny in maybe some of these police shootings in the late 80s and early 90s. I mean, you had a story that was told very much from the police narrative, and maybe you would throw in a quote or two from a resident that was kind of, you know, skeptical of what happened or questioned what happened. But those stories did tend to present a police account. But yeah, so I mean, there's things that we can do just in terms of trying to get other perspectives in there. You know, just for me, it just comes down to getting back to just the basics of beat reporting and just journalism 101. I mean, you can't write these stories from the comfort of the newsroom or from your living room. Like, you have to go out, you got to put in the work, you got to knock on doors, try to scare up a witness or two and interview them and make sure that you know, you get their voices in the story to not only bring balance, but like just get a little closer to the truth. Or so.
Jamiles, is that a decent strategy for you as well as a national correspondent? I mean, how do you go about reporting?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly right. And obviously, the sort of, I mean, as I was listening to Libor speak, I mean, I was struck by the kind of parallel, right? That the way to report a beat is to, you know, get out on the streets and talk to people and make sure they know you and make sure you know them and et cetera, which is absolutely right. And that's also, you know, in these conversations about policing and community policing, that is so much of the language of how, you know, community policing means an officer walking a beat and people know them and they know people and they're known in the community, right? I mean, like it reminds me of there are some parallels in this work, in that they're public facing. They mean that you are a professional who's engaging with the general public. In many situations, you're engaging with the general public in the worst moment of their life, or one of the worst moments of their life, either as a reporter or as a police officer. And you have a responsibility in either one of those roles to approach people with dignity and respect, and as though their lives and their stories matter. But yeah, as a national reporter, I think my sort of biggest caution and my biggest fear and thing that I worry about is, again, this idea of, you know, parachuting, and that you're just going to see a thing and go, oh, that's a shiny object, let's go report that really quick, and sort of behave very like you're just trying to get all the resources. You're trying to get all of the little bits of story so that you can have a nice shiny story for your national outlet, and then you move on. And I do think that as national reporters, we have that same responsibility to treat people as though their stories matter. They don't owe them to us, you know, but that we can offer people a platform. We can offer them space to process what's happened and how they feel about it.
I think Julie's going to cue us up on some questions from the audience. But before we do that, I want to just say to you guys, what I wish Michael would ask me this. What do you wish I had asked you and I didn't ask you that you want to comment on?
I mean, one thing that I know we talked about addressing that we didn't spend any time on is language, and I think it's maybe worth just touching really quickly. That we should be thoughtful about the language that we're using. It matters and it's purposeful, and especially on a crime beat where stories, just as a matter of fact, stories tend to start to feel very rote. A lot of crime stories you could, you know, basically take all of the copy and repost it the next day with a different address, different particulars. But they're often very similar. So I think we need to be thoughtful about how the language we use in those stories creates a narrative. It creates a kind of metascape, right? Like we start to, as the general public, we just start to assume that crime is always of the shape and nature of the language used in crime stories. So I think, you know, one simple example for me is the use of the term officer-involved shooting. And it's a term that, you know, I think you really, when you think about it, it's kind of funny, right? Newspaper editors are historically allergic to the passive voice. That's one of the first, like, cardinal rules of news writing is you don't write passively, you write active. What happened? Who did it? And yet we've adopted this police jargon that is sort of the ultimate passive voice in these moments. Why? It's not helping our readers understand anymore what happened, and that's our ultimate responsibility. You know, I'd argue that we've probably largely adopted it either out of laziness or out of deference to police officers or to police departments, I should say, and police officials. And it's just one of those examples. Look, it's understandable. I don't think the point here is to you know, point blame at anyone. I think it's saying this is a way that we can be better and we can inform our readers better, and we can challenge some of the inherent deference that our industry, especially in the local news, has had towards departments and police officials.
Libor, you have anything you want to toss in on that?
There was some, I guess, initial conversations that we had around things, short-term changes that we might be able to push for from a crime beat perspective. So one thing, like doing away with the crime blotter, And, you know, I say this as someone that's fallen into this trap, I guess, especially early on in my career, but have tried to get away from this to a certain degree, writing these sort of novelty crime stories. You know, somebody who has an unusual sounding name who's accused of a crime. He or she isn't any like particular danger to the public, but we write about him or her because they have, again, there's some novelty, something that to latch onto that we think people might be interested in, or somebody that, you know, we had a story a while back about a guy who got caught with an insane amount of gummies in his possession, and he ended up getting charged. So, you know, there's nothing wrong with it sort of from a news standpoint, right? Because the guy was charged. We can name him, we can identify him. Does he pose a threat to the public? Like, is this something that's really newsworthy? I think we're starting to have these conversations, and especially as there's a greater recognition or awareness of how the criminal justice system ensnares people, and how, you know, stories like that and the charges can have like these long-lasting effects or impacts on people's lives. So I think we're starting to have these sort of conversations internally and moving away from these kind of throwaway crime stories.
Thanks to both of you. I mean, I was thinking of the Inquirer on Mondays. We generally have a blotter that's sort of the roundup of the weekend, and so there'll be 4 or 5, 6 horrific things that happen. And, you know, one might argue that you're better off picking one and just doing a deep story on what happened in that particular neighborhood, what happened in that community, as opposed to, you know, minimizing all the horrific things that happened over the weekend. Good points, both. Julie, you got some questions for us?
We have 4 different questions. I don't know if we're going to get to all of them, but we'll start and see. So the first question is from Deborah Fisher. What are the biggest gaps in reporting that you see at the local levels? It's a multi-part question. What information are journalists not getting that they need to get and share with the public? And what perhaps are the hardest pieces of information to get? So Libor, why don't you start maybe, and then others can weigh in.
I'd say, you know, more of the big picture piece is stories with sweep. We don't always, and I would, you know, partly is this, the blame falls on me, but we don't always write those stories. We don't always connect the dots for our readers the way that we should. Because and that's, you know, partly a product of working in a daily newspaper environment and to some degree having to feed the beast and churn out daily stories and you know, always have the luxury of time and space to go out and do those interviews and write a story like that with some sweep. But we have to be aware of that, and we do have to occasionally take a step back and say, hey, I'm not going to write anything for a couple of days. Let me work on this weekender that hopefully will provide some sort of context to our readers and give them a sense of how did we get here. I mean, the riots and the protests that followed George Floyd's death, they weren't only a result of this, you know, horrific incident. There was kindling along the way. There were years of sort of frayed relationships between the police department and the communities they serve, harassment, other brutality cases. And so it is important for us to make that connection for readers. I think in some sense that's where the national outlets, like they really shine, because they do come in and write these sweeping stories that really provide a lot of context. So I think I'd say personally that's an area that I need to improve on. So
I'll go with mean, I think public records requests, it's thankless work. It's boring. It's hard. You get a lot of no's, and you have to keep, bothering people. But I think, so much of the most impactful criminal justice journalism that is done, right? I mean, almost everything. Well, there is more of the criminal justice system that is accessible through public records than most of the other things you will cover in this world, right? Like if you're a business reporter, there's a limited amount of things that are going to be subject to FOIA law. If you're in the criminal justice system, like there's limitations here, but every organization, be it the police department, the courts, the prosecutor's office, are government agencies, and they are subject to FOIA law. So depending on what state you're in, you may have a lot of leeway to ask them for their stuff. And yeah, I mean, I think like kind of pound for pound, those stories have had a bigger impact and a lot of the other stuff that we spend a lot more time doing. It's more glamorous and it's more fun.
Mike, do you want to add anything?
No, I think we've got the experts here.
Okay. All right. Okay. So the next question we have, excuse me, is from Annabelle Sosa, who asks, how effective is it to cover the police logs? What is your stance on publicly reporting a person's name and rap sheet for low-level misdemeanor crimes?
I think we should not do that. I think it's actually that simple. I don't see what the news value is. I don't know how that makes a reader, a citizen, better apprised of what's going on in their community, and the negative ramifications of that for folks when they, I think also the rules have to change with the moment, right? I mean, there was a time when you reported that and it went into a piece of paper that, a kid threw at everybody's door in the morning, and whatever percentage of people saw it and they went, okay, like whatever. Then it was Joe Smith was arrested for a bad check, and it didn't register at all to them. Now, when we write those stories, it is attached to that person's name in perpetuity. They can go apply for a job in 5 years, and if they have not hired someone to clean their internet presence, that will be the first thing that person sees. So it's not, right, like I think we in this industry have not done a great job of recognizing how digitalization has changed the side effects and some of the negative effects of reporting. I think we need to consider that before we do things for clicks or before we do things because we've always done them.
Yeah, simple as that.
I will do that a little on that one. I mean, too often we'll hear from someone who, when they were 17, they were 18, they were out drinking with their buddies and they did something stupid, and then it turned up, in the paper, and in terms of the paper, it turns up online. And so now they're 35 and they can't get a job. So it's a problem. I think all of us, all the entire industry needs to be given some thought about at what point is it worth, do we actually write about something? And if it's just a ha-ha kind of misdemeanor thing that, might make for a good, 400-word story, is that the right thing to do?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's okay.
Well, I was going to mention you actually brought this up in an earlier email, this Cleveland experiment, the right to be forgotten. I mean, that's yeah. I wish we had a sort of a mechanism like that where we could revisit some older stories, and there was a process for people to, petition for them to be removed, because I think it's got to come back to the age-old question: what's the news value? How does our audience benefit from it? And it shouldn't be that it's entertainment, or it's gonna make them chuckle for a moment. Like we have to be more deliberate.
And I'll say this too. I totally understand if this conversation brings up, especially for people who've been in the industry a long time, a real discomfort that, are we sanitizing the news? Is this a form of activism? Are we, free speech, freedom of the press? We need to be able to report these things. And so I'd say, I think first and foremost, I'm not suggesting laws that say you can't do this. I'm suggesting that we as an industry take a deeper consideration as to what are, the decisions that we make have ramifications for people's lives. And I think we need to do a cost-benefit analysis in a really fair and empathetic way before we just go sort of banding about the First Amendment and saying we can say whatever we want. And I also think it's just about, I guess we've already said it, news value. That's like the key word. Again, just because we've always reported it, and just because we can, and just because people will click on it, we make editorial judgments all the time. There are lots of things that happen in our communities and in our society that we don't write stories about, things that matter, we don't write about arguments that people have in their homes about big hot button issues. Why not? It might be clickable. It might be interesting. I might like to know what the mayor's chief of staff said to his wife about Donald Trump on Tuesday. Like I might click on that if someone wrote it. We don't write it because we sort of, A, we're not there, but B, because we kind of understand that not everything is fit to be in print. And I just think we need to keep that in mind and not be so quick to, again, just because we've always done it doesn't mean we keep doing
it. We are going to not end up having too much time to talk about it, but that issue, among others, is one of the things that has so eroded trust among journalists in many communities, particularly communities of color, or prevented trust from developing to begin with in many communities. So, we won't spend time talking about the opportunities of, developing audiences that we're missing right now because of how we've covered them and because we've misrepresented, mischaracterized, missed them in our newsrooms entirely. But I think you've just sort of surfaced some of the important pieces of it. I know we have two other questions, so I'm going to go ahead and see if we can at least get to one of them. And this one is from Ted Guest, and it will start off with you, Libor. He says, given local newsroom staffing limitations, how big does the story have to be for the reporter to spend time reporting among witnesses and in the community, most crime stories, or only big stories like the George Floyd case? And Mike, you may want to weigh in on this as well as somebody who also, is involved in newsroom management.
How big, and are we, sorry, just to clarify, are we talking about police killings, or are we just talking about crime stories in general?
He didn't specify. I would say crime or policing stories.
Crime stories in general. Again, I guess I would go back to the idea that we're confronted with sort of unique challenges in a newsroom where we have to turn daily stories, and so sometimes the realities are that you're running up against deadline and you can't afford to leave your desk, so maybe you have to make these calls from your desk as you're writing. But I do try to get out into the field as much as I possibly can. I'd say it varies by newsroom. The Strib is like we do have the benefit of being a larger newsroom where some smaller. I've worked at smaller dailies before where you're forced to write 4 or 5 stories a day, and so you don't have that luxury. So it is nice being in a larger newsroom where I if I do have the time, I can go out there and do a little bit of beat reporting. But
Or has coronavirus changed that at all for you?
in what sense? As far as like keeping me indoors?
Yeah, like, you know, the impulse to go out in the street, has it changed the threshold for what will send you out?
I don't know if I'm telling on myself here, but I still go out. Yeah. I mean, you have to, and there's so much that you can gain from visiting a crime scene. And it's not just about, you know, adding color to the story about who's hanging out and watching things, or how many shell casings are on the street, but you just your reporting has just a lot more depth if you're actually there, and you can actually put the reader, you know, situate them right there, give them a better appreciation for what happened. So yeah, I've been going out with mask, obviously, but
Wear that mask. You know, this is a bit of a juggling thing. I think, you know, reporters are under a lot of demands to turn out stuff quickly. But most reporters know when there's something else there. When there's a bigger, deeper story there, they've talked to 2 or 3 people, and there's something that they need to go back and take a look at. So, I mean, sometimes I think you have to turn out that daily story, and then, you know, this is to my fellow editors. You gotta listen to your reporters, and they say there's some more there. Give them the opportunity to explore it. I mean, you can't give them 6 months, but, you know what I'm saying? There's, you know, give them a little time. Because
just at the Marshall Project, they can give you 6 months sometimes.
Well, you know, yes, you are blessed. It's like somebody, I mean, we have to listen. Editors have to. We have to do a better job of listening to the people that we should be trusting to get this stuff done.
So we have 2 more questions, and I know we're not going to get to both of them. So I'm going to say on one of them from Elizabeth Murray is going back to the discussion about language. What would you suggest as suitable alternatives to officer-involved shooting? Are there any other phrases commonly used by journalists that you can cite that shouldn't be used anymore or should have alternative language used? I think that's a great question. I don't know if you can answer it thoroughly in 1 minute. So
I mean, I can simply answer just say what happened, right? Don't use jargon, just say what happened. So instead of there was an officer involved shooting at the corner of, you know, 14th and Broad, say a man was shot by police at the corner of 14th and Broad. It's no less economical, and it's more clear if you know that that's what happened. I also want to mention quickly, I'm not a hardliner on this issue. Like, if you are listening to the scanner and you're writing a super quick news stub about something that happened, and all you literally know is police involved shooting, you don't know who shot who was hit, like, it may be the proper term to use in that instance. It shouldn't become a stand-in when there's clearer, plain English language. Police officers shot, you know, John Doe. It communicates more to the reader. It's a better. That's not a political or ethical statement. That's actually just a journalism point. Like, it's better writing.
That's what's happening in Inquirer. There's been a style change in the last few weeks from a police-involved shooting to police shot X, or police killed, you know, shot and killed, you know, just so it's real clear what happened. Once you have the information, yeah.
I feel like I have so many more questions. I'm sure there are other questions that people have sent in that we haven't had a chance to answer. I wish we had more time. This is really only the beginning, or maybe the middle of many conversations that have been ongoing privately or in small groups or in single newsrooms that need to be had more publicly. And I want to thank you, Libor and Jamiles, for your insight and time this morning. And I want to thank you, Mike, for bringing us together and leading this great conversation. And thank you all for being here, for spending time with us. If we didn't get to your question, I'll share it with our panelists and pass any responses on to you. I also want to let you know the News Leaders Association and the Journalism Institute are here to help during this very, very challenging time. We've waived all registration fees for programming since March in light of the pandemic. And that's at a savings of more than $52,000 for participants like you. So we hope you'll give this work a thumbs up with a donation in support of learning like today's. And we hope you'll complete a survey about your experience with today's program so that we can design other learning that will be most valuable for journalists like you. So you'll receive links to do both of those things in an email shortly, along with a link to a recording of this program. So stay well. Thank you again for being here, and we hope to see you again soon.
Thank you.